Hello fellow humans, today we are going to be working on remodeling the Blacksmith. I begin by removing some trees from out front and creating a block palette from the original blocks. Then I begin removing the original structure. By removing the original structure, I have a clean space from which to work from. In the case of removing the Blacksmith, I had to be very careful when it came to removing the lava to ensure that it didn't end up going everywhere. I also had to remove several trees in the surrounding areas before I could really get started with the original design. In the case of the Blacksmith, it was on quite a hill, so I chose to remove some of the terrain and flatten it a little bit. This allowed me to maximize the available building area whilst still keeping some of the hill intact. With the ground flattened, I avoided any sheer cliffs and could clean up the area, patching in some additional holes. Once this was done, I could begin to lay out my structure. I chose to use different colors of wool blocks when it came to this structure. That way I could identify the different areas for the dark gray wool represents the blacksmith's house, whereas I will be using light gray wool for the forge area and orange wool to represent the forge itself. By breaking it up this way, I can get a general idea for the look and design of the build before I begin building. This keeps me from having to do as much rearranging once I have the actual blocks in place. Once I have the layout fully planned, I begin swapping out the wool blocks for the blocks of the build itself. I begin by using the smooth stone slabs as they were included in the original Blacksmith design, and I find that their ability to create a half slab stack really helps to break up builds. Then I begin creating the forge by creating a backsplash of stone and cobblestone and using the deep slate as a darker block around the forge itself. I think about adding this little design aspect at the top, and I will use it several times before ultimately removing it. I use the magma block because it looks kind of like hot coals, and add in some iron bars to just create kind of a backstop and keep the villager from falling into the lava. Now that we have the forge area relatively laid out, I can continue building up the chimney behind it. I use a combination of tough, mossy cobble and cobblestone to create this design before moving on to the flooring of this area of the build. I opt to use stone and gravel to create a very simple floor, but also keep it with a very natural feeling. I then swap out those blocks around the forge for just some stairs to give it some more visual interest. Now I can begin adding in the villager workstation block, and I play with that design feature again before ultimately deciding that it's better off not being there. I then add in some raw ores, as those would be common in a forge area where tools are being made from them. Now that the main structures of the forge region are complete, I can begin building up the rest of the structure. I begin by marking it out with some of these oak pillars and some cobblestone walls to just generally create a surrounding of the area, and adding in some stairs that will allow you to get into the build. Once I do this, I get a frame around the upper section so that I can begin working on the roof. Whilst I originally decided on the oak logs, I go ahead and strip them just to create a smoother design and to allow for more contrast when I go to build the rest of the house. When I begin working on the roof, I debate between a flat roof or this angle design. I eventually decide that the flat design pairs better with the original Blacksmith house. Keeping with the flat roof of the original design, I do a step down section of the roof before working on the chimney. I really struggle with what height the chimney should be at, trying it up high, then down really low, before finding some comfortable middle ground. I'm not sure I'm 100% happy with this height, but it's what I end up sticking to. Now that I have the forge area complete, I can begin working on the blacksmith's house. I make this a relatively large house for the village, as in terms of members of a village, I find a blacksmith would be very important, as their profession would be utilized by almost everyone in the village. So this house ends up having 2 stories. It has a basement story which comes out at the underside of the hill, which is one of the convenient aspects of having this build located on a hill, and then it has the upstairs that connects directly into the forge. If you wanted to replicate this design, you could technically add a ladder up to an attic area. However, I chose to make that inaccessible in my version of the build, just as I didn't need the space, and attics aren't my favorite thing to build as they're not super practical. Now I can go ahead and build up the roof of the house now that I have the basic structure of the lower levels completed. I realize now that this build is on an even center, and at this point it is way too late for me to want to change that, so I just end up having to stick with it as I begin roofing the design. I start out using the deep slate tiles as my trim and oak stairs as my main roofing material. However, the oak stairs really do just become too much oak for me. Most village houses are originally roofed in oak planks, and whilst they are a really nice block, they're also a very busy block. So that many oak stairs really just do tend to overwhelm a build. So I end up swapping it out for a stone and cobblestone feel, which I also just think blends better into the existing blocks. I also decided to move the roof up slightly as it was not lining up the way I wanted it to with the roof on the forge portion. So now that I've torn that out, I can go ahead and build it up to what I want it to be using those stone blocks once again. The stone blocks look really nice with the deep slate trim, and the whole roof comes out looking very clean but also kind of rustic and having a little bit more of a medieval feel than some of the other builds I've done in the village. If I had built the roof on an odd center where there was a single block in the middle, I probably would have taken the deep slate tile and run an accent strip down the middle of the roof, just as I find it makes a very good center line for roofs and creates some visual interest. However, I did not with this build, so that didn't happen. It's definitely a change I would make if I were to do this again. Now I can start adding in the walls of the build. I go ahead and choose to opt with the oak planks, however I do a lot to create some visual interest with these. I use the signs across the stripped oak logs in addition to the planks, and then I will ultimately add windows. I also go ahead and add out this little bump out section on the lower level. That way there is a walkout to what will eventually be Town Square. As you notice, the village center is already located down there, so I figured this would be a good place for the house to have a secondary interest. Now I can begin putting the windows in. In between the windows, I go ahead and place these trap doors. I originally thought of them as shutters, however, because they end up lining all of the blocks in that middle section, they could honestly just be any type of visual interest. Now I begin working on that attic part of the build. I use some stripped oak and then add in some polished deep slate, as it really does just kind of create a bright and open block for that space. Now I'm going to work on the inside. I have to go ahead and dig out that basement before adding in the stone bricks on the walls and the oak flooring. Then I can move upstairs to go ahead and begin decorating. I'm trying to keep the wood I use in this build to oak, as that's what's used in a Plains village, and I want to keep this build relatively original. You'll see here me placing in the roof of this lower level, and you'll notice that there's definitely space up there for a third floor. However, in the original Blacksmith design, there's that dangerous roof section that's generically unlit. I did remember to light mine up, I believe, and that was a characteristic that I was like, yeah, maybe it does have an empty attic. Maybe mobs could spawn there and ruin your day when they explode as you're living in the blacksmith. Then I began adding in this kitchen with furnaces and that little smokestack. I used the double barrels with the iron door on front just as sort of a little refrigerator type area. And then I use these trapdoors to create a little table. And I use the trick where I can like put the trapdoor down to be able to place a lantern on top. Then I add in some couches and just a couple little paintings to just finish off the upstairs. We have this nice staircase that comes downstairs, and then I go ahead and section the lower level off into 2 small bedrooms. I don't like how all of the oak looks, so I go ahead and add some of the oak log that's stripped, just to give it some more visual interest. And these are very small bedrooms, so you can see this little peek in here. There's really not a lot of space, just a couple beds, couple barrels, and a painting on the wall in that one. The other bedroom doesn't even get that much. It really does just end up getting like a barrel and maybe like a flower pot. I then tuck a little desk in this corner before heading my way outside. That is essentially all of the interior I do in this build. I keep it relatively simple. I thought about tucking some bookshelves underneath that staircase. However, I want to reserve the bookshelves for this village for somewhere like a library or a librarian's house or any build like that. Once I come outside, I add a little porch and a flower pot. And then I go ahead and replace some of the trees I cut down originally. Now these both grow up to be pretty short little trees, but by adding a couple leaves around, I find it just really finishes off the build. As you can see, we've got the forge area and the main house, the smoke chimney just rising there, and it is perfectly ready for a blacksmith to move in. Now, as we approach these screenshots at the end of the video, I hope you really did enjoy this build, and be sure to leave a like down below if that is in fact the case. If you have any ideas as to which village building you'd like to see me remodel next, make sure to leave a comment and I'll be sure to take that into consideration. Make sure you subscribe to see what we get building next, and until next time, goodbye!